We have hit my least favorite part of Matthew, chapters 24 and 25. I tried to split them up so as to spend more time on each of them. I failed. Because you can't split them up. This is one long discourse. And it's one difficult discourse. It starts out simple enough. But sometimes you ask a question, you think it's a really easy one, should have a short answer. And a couple hours later, you're like, I'm so sorry I asked. Well, this is kind of one of those moments. So if you remember from last week's, we finished at the end of chapter 23, Jesus had just reamed out the scribes and the Pharisees. It's like the culmination of his conflict with them by proclaiming 7 woes against them for, blocking the gate to heaven and teaching people to become twice as bad about it as they are, and all these sort of things. And so we begin today by saying Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Right? Matthew's pretty low-key about this. But if you look at, say, Mark 13, we get more of a dialogue. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. They are really odd." Luke, of course, with his very meticulous approach to history, does not overlook this moment. The way he phrases it in Luke 21, verse 5, while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings. Now, what you have to picture here is a building largely made of polished marble and adorned with gold leaf and plaques of, different contributors and things. Something really, really magnificent. A monument. Naturally impressive. And as they are doing the whole tourist ooh-ah thing with Jesus, Jesus turns to them and says, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Which would sound bad enough, except if you think about what the temple meant to the Jewish people. When we move into next quarter, we're going to look at the return from exile. When Ezra, Nehemiah, Habakkuk, and all of them, where they're trying to come back and restore Israel after Jerusalem's been just basically razed to the ground. It's a smoldering ruin. And it's been a ruin for a full generation, like a whole lifespan. And if you remember, when they rebuilt the foundations of the temple, it said that, the younger people, they were cheering and they were happy, but the old people who remembered the former temple were crying because it was a letdown. It was so much less than it had been. But now they've got this temple. Herod had been really hard at work making this thing into a monument, to the point where it's called Herod's temple, even though Herod wasn't actually really Jewish. So to say that a time was coming when this monument would be torn down, naturally, they've got some questions. And so in private, the disciples come to him, and here's the question times 2. There's 2 questions. They may have thought they were only asking one question. It's really hard to know what they thought they were asking. We only have the words they said. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? Now, to me, that sounds like 3 questions, but in Greek, it is actually only 2 grammatically, because they really do think that the sign of his coming and the close of the age are the same thing. So it's, well, when will this happen to the temple? And they may well have been thinking, when this happens to the temple, obviously this means something new is coming. The thing I really, really dislike about this passage, it's the thing that trips people up all the time. If you skip to verse 34. So here are the 2 questions that we're seeking to answer. And here's this sort of pivot point. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And a lot of people are like, wait a second. What he's talking about here sounds a lot like the second coming. So was he wrong? Did he miscalculate when his return would be? That it would be within this generation? And we're not given any help on this in the text. So let's listen to what his answer is, first off, and try to see whether you think he is answering the first question, when will the temple be pulled down, basically, or the second question, what are the signs of your coming and of the close of the age? But what really pulls this back from the edge for me, I do appreciate his first response, right? Normally, when somebody says, well, when is that going to happen? You respond with a time period, right? A date, at least a month, maybe a day, hour. Jesus says, see that no one leads you astray. Whenever we're talking about endings, any eschatological conversation really does need to be founded on this command. See that no one leads you astray. Because you know the history. Even if you've not studied it, you've heard of all the predictions that have been made. Oh, Jesus is coming on such and such a day. Jesus is going to show up in this place. Even non-believers, they have their doomsday clock, where the world will end at, right? We're getting close to the world's end. We're pushing on forward to this. And Jesus, knowing people, starts out with, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. You'll hear of wars, rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. So you're thinking about this. They're looking for a schedule, and he is telling them principles. First off, don't believe just anybody who comes along saying, I'm the Christ, or, oh, this is the end. This is obviously a sign of the end. Because you talk about wars, rumors of wars, what do we go with? This is famines, earthquakes. You think about all of these things as almost natural signs that people look to of omens of bad news. So the warning is apt. But that's just what he calls the beginning of the birth pains in verse 8. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Now, mind you, I've never had any children, but I've heard the stories that the pains escalate. They get more frequent. They get more painful. And this is how he's describing the signs of his coming. Because once we've got wars and rumors of wars, famines and earthquakes, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. You'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. So if it's not bad enough that we've got all these external omens going on, now we're having internal dissension, betrayals, backslidings. False prophets will arise and lead many astray. Lawlessness will be increased. And the love of many will grow cold. At this point, I would have been really sorry I asked. It would have been just like, I didn't want to know that. You know, if it has to happen, sure, but just rather not see it coming. But in addition to, see that no one leads you astray, he gives another. The one who endures to the end will be saved. There is that light. And also, the light spreads. The gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. So we're at this point and we're like, okay, so the end will come. And we're only in verse 14. And in 34, he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. But we continue. Verse 15. Everybody's favorite abomination of desolation. We're like, all right, you had to drag Daniel into this. And there have been interpretations all since Daniel said the word, since he wrote it and sent it out. What is this abomination of desolation? Some people are like, oh, that was Antiochus Epiphanes V, where he was, you know, he pulled down all of the sacred fixtures of the temple and sacrificed pigs on the altar to desecrate it. And you're like, well, okay, that's one thing, but that's been a few hundred years. And now Jesus is saying it again. Abomination of desolation. When you see it, standing in the holy place. Well, this is another point where it's really useful to look at parallel passages, because Luke, not speaking to a primarily Gentile audience, puts it this way. This is Luke 21, verse 20. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation has come near. You have two words here, abomination, not a word we use very often, but it is a sacrilege, it's a blasphemy, it's something that should not stand in holy places. And then there's desolation, the absolute destruction, the wiping out of anything good. And if you were to go to a contemporary account, which, I mean, Josephus is not exactly your unbiased journalistic eyewitness. He was a Jewish general who surrendered to the Romans and became very good friends with the general Titus, who became Emperor Titus later on. But he described the state of Jerusalem in that 60 to 70 AD period as about as near to hell on earth as they could have imagined, where they had factions inside who were continually warring, killing one another. They turned the temple into a military fortress, and people died there trying to offer their everyday sacrifices. And that's before the Romans surrounded the place with their armies. And you'd think, well, as a gesture of friendship or kindness, they let in all of the Passover travelers. But then they wouldn't let them out again. So you've got a city overloaded with extra people, with no incoming food, and only their water sources that they already had, and a besieging army outside, and factions fighting inside. They were not able to count how many people had died. So whatever the specific abomination of desolation might be, there is a moment where you know things are about as bad as they're going to get. And Jesus' command is very simple. When you see this, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And if you look at Eusebius, who, well, yes, he wrote in the 4th century, church historian, first Christian church historian. He makes a statement that was told, right, that prior to the shutting down of Jerusalem by the Romans, the Christian population that remained there received a prophecy that warned them to flee. And so they had left Jerusalem and were not swept up in this hell on earth. And you know how urgent it's going to be when he says, if you're up on your housetop relaxing, don't go down to pack a bag. He says, don't go down to take whatever's in the house, just go. If you're in the field, don't go back home to get, cleaned up or grab your cloak or anything like that, just run. And alas, for women who are pregnant or are nursing infants in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. These are all obstacles that would hinder hasty travel. Because he says there will be such great tribulation as has not been seen from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be. And of course, that probably is hyperbole, but it's not terribly far from the mark. If you could ask people who had been there, I'm sure they would agree. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those things will be cut short. And then, so you've got this set of warnings. Things are going to be bad. Run. Don't stop for your stuff. Just go. Life is more important than things. But then, he says, this is 24:23, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, don't believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. We're back where we started again. Don't be led astray. There will be no secret coming of Christ. If they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe it. As the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And then you have this rather odd sort of metaphor. Wherever the carcass is, there the vultures will gather. Now, not having that many vultures in our area, you might substitute crows, right? You see crows hopping around by the side of the road, you know what's there. They're not there for their health or enjoyment. There's roadkill. They're there for a meal. It's really obvious. And so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And if verse 34 had actually come after verse, let's say 22, life would be much easier for interpreters of Scripture. But we continue. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now this sounds a whole lot more like, right, second coming. And the ambiguity is by no means relieved as we go on to verse 32. From the fig tree, learn its lesson, right? So basically it's like, you look at a fig tree, you know certain things. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. It's one of those common sense things for people who live near fig trees. The kind of thing that in where I grew up is more like the corn tasseling. You know what time of the year it is when you see the tassels pop on the corn, right? You know summer is getting close to being over. Well, he says, when you see all of these things happening, you know that he's near at the very gates. And here we go. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And a lot of people have come up with some very creative possible solutions to what seems to be an insoluble problem. Maybe he meant generation as in this type of people will still be here. But normally, that word generation is used to suggest just what it sounds like, basically a 40-year period. And then he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And so if you're talking about the fall of Jerusalem, well, that is about 40 years from when he says this. But the second coming still hasn't happened yet. In fact, he goes on to say concerning that day and hour, no one knows. And here's another thing that people kind of trip up about. Not even the Son? I mean, obviously, if the angels of heaven don't know, well, that's one thing. But the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, he doesn't know? How can he not know? Which then, of course, you have to fall back on, well, what was Jesus like? Theologians have gone to great pains to describe his dual nature, both fully human and fully God. Neither of the one mixed with the other. He's not like a really supercharged human or, sort of a toned down God, but both exist side by side in one person. And when I read this, I think of Philippians, right? Let this mind be in you as was in Christ. That whole, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. In his human nature, he relinquished some of the knowledge that he had a right to as being fully God. It's a kind of an odd and intriguing insight into the relationship of the Trinity, isn't it? The Father only knows the day and the hour. And the signs, right? Remember, we started this out with saying, what are the signs of your coming? And he's given a bunch of signs for something. But then he goes and says, as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until that day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So on the one hand, they're saying, well, what are the signs that indicate your coming? And he's giving them these ideas. Well, let me put it this way. When will this be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So they're looking for signs. We're always looking for indicators, right? We want to know what time it is. How close are we? Is he coming soon? But he then bluntly says, you know what? Things are going to be going on as they always went on. And Peter reiterates this. You go to 2 Peter chapter 3, where he talks about scoffers will come, with scoffing, of course, that's what they do. And they'll say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. And Jesus says, yeah, that's kind of how it's going to work. It'll come unexpectedly. You look for signs like thinking you'll be able to predict. Oh, I saw that sign, we're that much closer. But it's not going to work that way. He says, 2 men in the field, one will be taken, one left. And there are those, of course, if you've read the Left Behind series and whatnot, who have very specific and interesting interpretations of this. But really, it's a matter of everybody will be going about their business until the moment comes, and once the moment comes, there's no turning back. One will be taken, one will be left. And so the rest of this is all about signs or no signs, be ready. And he tells a series of parables to support this. There are a couple of mini parables. The master of the house, whose house is going to be burgled, right? If you knew for a fact that someone was going to come at a certain time to rob your house, what would you do? Oh, you'd prevent it. You'd be ready for him. But he's like, but that's not how it works. They don't make appointments to rob your house. And the Son of Man has not made an appointment for his return. Not with us, anyway. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Mini parable number 2, the faithful servant, keeping the household running in anticipation of the master's return. You have two choices. Either you ignore the fact that he's delayed and keep going, just doing what you need to do because he could come at any moment, or you say, my master is delayed, and start to abuse your privileges, to slack off. Either way, the master will come on a day unexpected. For those who have been keeping things running, keeping everything ticking over as it should, because they want to be ready. They want whatever the time, it doesn't matter, I'm going to be ready. They get, blessed is that servant. He will set him over all his possessions. The other ones, the ones who figure, there's no sign of him coming. Well, they get, verse 51, cut in pieces and put with the hypocrites in the place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, right? Metaphor for eternal hell. Be ready. All right, full-on parable, 10 bridesmaids. The culture was, right, bridegroom left his house, went to the bride's house, ceremony happened there, and he brought her back. There would be people waiting to welcome them home. But if the party ran long, it could be really late. So they'd had to be ready. They'd have to have lamps. Because who wants the awkwardness of, hang on just a second, I have to find the key. But I can't see it. So no. You need to be ready. In the parable, right, it's half and half. Half were ready. They brought their provisions. They were set. Didn't matter when he came. They were going to pop right up and turn their lamps on. And in they go to the second half of the party, really. But the others were like, it won't go that late. I'm sure he'll be here any minute. I find it interesting that all 10 fell asleep. It says, as the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. Which you would think, if he's talking about, stay awake, stay ready, this would be, a bad thing. But you know what happens? If you've prepared ahead of time, I have to tell you, not being a morning person, I have to have everything set up that I can just basically walk into it in the morning with the least amount of thought. I've got my clothes set out in a particular order, right? I've got food put together, ready to just drop into the lunch bag. I can't think in the morning. So I know I've got to be ready. I have to have things prepared or I'm going to be late. Well, here these bridesmaids, these virgins, 5 of them were like, this could go on all night. We better be ready. And so they were. They get up, they trim their lamps. The foolish one said to the wise, well, give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out. But they're like, we didn't prepare for you, basically. Interesting point there. Everyone makes their own preparations. You are each responsible for your own readiness. And so the foolish ones are like, well, if you don't have enough for us, we have to go to the dealers. In the middle of the night? You know how long that's going to take to wake people up and get them to open their shops to sell you some oil? No wonder then that while they were going to buy, the bridegroom comes and those who were ready went in and the door was shut. And when they come knocking, Lord, Lord, open to us, what do they get? I don't know you. You weren't ready for me. And he reiterates, you know neither the day nor the hour. Parable of investment. A lot of people call this the parable of the talents. That kind of, in English, gets muddled because we talk about talent as an ability to do things. But this really is the master investing large sums. 1 talent as a unit of money was 20 years worth of the average laborer's wages. And so he gives to one of his servants 5 of them. That's 100 years worth of common person's wages. And the other one, he gets 2, 40 years. And the one, he gets 1. And it says, each according to his ability. And then he went away. So each one was tasked with what he could cope with and given the responsibility to make something of it. So the master comes back and says, after a long time, and he's settling accounts with them, and the one who got the 5 came forward and he brought 5 more. He doubled it. That's 200 years worth of a common person's wages. He did well. And so the master says, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. You know how much that means the master has if he says that 100 years, 200 years worth of a common person's wages are a little? I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. All right, second person comes up. They'd only gotten 2 talents worth of money, but they doubled that too. And they too get praised. You've been faithful over a little. I'll set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And then that one guy with a 1 talent, it was within his capabilities. That's what we're told. He should have been able. But what did he do? He buried it. And how does he describe his master? I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. So he's given 20 years worth of wages. And he's so freaked out about not doing anything, basically not being able to live up to the expectations, that he does nothing. And the master quite naturally says, all right, so at the very least, you ought to have invested my money so that at least I would get the interest as well as what was my own. I mean, bare minimum, that would have been acceptable. if you weren't confident in your own abilities. But here's the outcome. You take what he has and give it to the one who has 10. And in another gospel, people protest. They're like, but he's already got 10. For to everyone who has, will more be given, and he'll have an abundance. From the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So these parables have all gone to support this idea that you don't know the time, the day, the hour. You just need to be ready. Each one is individually responsible for their own readiness, and each one is given tasks to do in that time period that are suitable for their abilities. And it's your job to follow through with that, to have something to present when the master does return. But then he closes with a scene of judgment, which should not be any surprise given the ending of all of these parables, right? Where people will be separated, allies to God, enemies to God, God's people and those who have refused him. And they'll both be measured by the same measuring stick, and that is whether or not when they found him hungry, they gave him food, found him thirsty, gave him drink, found him a stranger, showed him hospitality, found him ill-dressed, lacking in coverings, and clothed him, sick, visited, ministered to him, in prison, visited him, ministered to him, and both will say, I don't remember ever seeing you in any of those situations. But the key is, how did they treat the least of these, his brothers? That gives you a hint about what the work is that each one of us has been given to do while we wait and watch. To be his hands, his feet, his voice in the world. And whether we did this or not is going to weigh heavily into how we are judged at the end. Not what we said, because if you remember earlier in Matthew, there was a part of there where he said, they'll say, Lord, Lord, did we not do miracles in your name? But that's not what we're being judged on. That isn't the work he gave us to do. This is the last of the major discourses that Jesus gave his disciples. And if you're looking at Matthew as a discipleship manual, this one is weighty, to say the least. This is what it means to be a disciple, to be ready to do the work given until whatever that day is comes. But there's another lesson he's going to give them. This one a visible one, an enacted object lesson of what it means to be a disciple of this particular master. And that's where next week we will actually wrap up Matthew. The final lesson that the cross teaches. All right, you can stop recording now, and if anyone has any comments, so far I'm